Jake Morrison thought he was saving three strangers dying in the Mojave Desert. He had no idea that the woman breathing her last breath in his arms would leave him a letter that would shatter everything he believed about his past, transform his broken heart, and reveal a secret that would make him the father of two children who weren't even his blood. The sun was already a merciless eye in the Nevada sky when Jake Morrison's Mustang, Thunder, began to limp along the old cattle trail that ran parallel to Highway 93, 30 miles outside of Beatty. The horse's left front hoof had picked up a stone somewhere in the last few miles, and Jake could feel the uneven gait beneath him as Thunder favored the injured leg. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He dismounted and examined the hoof, carefully removing the sharp piece of shale that had lodged itself deep in the soft part of the frog. Jake was 42 years old and looked every day of it. 3 years of grief had carved deep lines around his eyes, turned his brown hair prematurely grey at the temples, and left him 20 pounds lighter than when Rebecca had been alive. His wedding ring still caught the light on his left hand, though his wife had been dead for 36 months, 14 days, and approximately 6 hours. Not that he was counting anymore. He had been riding the high desert trails for 2 weeks now, working as a freelance guide for a geological survey team mapping mineral deposits in the remote areas where vehicles couldn't go. The work was solitary, which suited him fine, and it paid enough to keep him moving from job to job across the Southwest, staying just ahead of his creditors and just behind his memories. Thunder was his only constant companion, a 10-year-old Mustang he'd rescued from a kill pen 3 years ago, around the same time his world had fallen apart. The horse was limping worse now, each step sending a slight tremor through his powerful frame. Jake knew he needed to rest the animal, find some shade and water, and let the bruised hoof heal. He had been planning to make camp near Willow Springs anyway, a natural water source marked on his topographical maps about 5 miles ahead. But first, he needed to tend to Thunder's injury properly. Jake pulled his well-worn veterinary kit from his saddlebags, a leftover from his brief attempt at ranching after Rebecca's death. He had tried to build a new life raising cattle on 40 acres outside of Bakersfield, but grief had a way of poisoning everything it touched, including his ability to care for anything that depended on him. The ranch had failed, like most of his ventures since Rebecca died, but the veterinary supplies had proven useful during his nomadic years in the desert. As he worked on Thunder's hoof, applying antiseptic and wrapping the injury with soft gauze, Jake noticed something unusual in the sky. 3 buzzards were circling lazy spirals about a quarter-mile to the northeast, their wings spread wide against the brutal blue sky. Jake had spent enough time in the desert to know what that meant. Something was dying out there, or already dead. He finished bandaging Thunder's hoof and stood up, shading his eyes with his hand to get a better look at the carrion birds. They were persistent, riding the thermals in tight circles that suggested their target wasn't moving. Could be a deer that had succumbed to the heat, or maybe a coyote that had wandered too far from water. But something about the scene nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't shake that this was different. Jake pulled his binoculars from his pack and focused on the area beneath the buzzards. At first, he saw only the usual desert landscape of sagebrush and barrel cactus, scattered rocks and sand. But then, just at the edge of his vision, he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. A flash of color that didn't belong in the natural palette of the desert, bright pink like a child's t-shirt. Jesus, Jake muttered, lowering the binoculars. His hands were shaking slightly as he packed the veterinary kit back into his saddlebags. He had seen enough tragedy in his life to recognize it from a distance, and every instinct he had was screaming that whatever was under those buzzards needed immediate help. Thunder whinnied softly as Jake mounted up, the horse sensing his riders. Sudden urgency, Despite the injured hoof, the Mustang responded to Jake's gentle pressure on his flanks, moving into a careful but determined trot toward the circling birds. The desert floor was treacherous here, full of holes and loose rocks that could break a horse's leg, but Jake trusted Thunder's sure-footed instincts. The animal had carried him safely through worse terrain than this. The buzzards were closer now, close enough that Jake could see their ugly red heads and hear the whisper of their wings as they rode the thermals. Whatever they were circling was just beyond a low ridge covered with Joshua trees, their twisted arms reaching toward the sky like desperate prayers. The heat was building toward its daily crescendo, and Jake could feel sweat beginning to soak through his shirt despite the early hour. As Thunder picked his way carefully up the rocky slope, Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Border crossers, maybe caught by the heat and the vast emptiness of the desert. It happened more often than people wanted to admit, especially in the summer when the Mojave became a furnace that killed indiscriminately. He had found bodies before during his wanderings, usually alone, usually men who had been abandoned by their guides when the going got tough. But the flash of pink he had seen through his binoculars suggested something different, something worse. Children didn't belong out here in this killing heat, dozens of miles from the nearest town or water source. Jake crested the ridge and stopped Thunder with a gentle pull on the reins. What he saw in the shallow depression below made his chest tighten with a mixture of horror and desperate hope. A woman lay in the meager shade of the largest Joshua tree, her body curled protectively around two small children. She was maybe 30 years old, Hispanic, with long black hair that had come loose from a ponytail and now fanned across the sand like spilled ink. Her clothes were torn and dusty, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. The children, twin girls who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, were pressed against her sides, their small faces buried in her shirt. For a moment, Jake thought they were all dead. The scene was too still, too perfect in its tragedy, like a photograph from some documentary about border crossings gone wrong. But then one of the little girls moved, just a slight shift of her head, and Jake was spurring Thunder down the slope as fast as the injured horse could safely manage. He dismounted before Thunder had completely stopped, his boots hitting the sand at a run. He dropped to his knees beside the small family, his hands hovering uncertainly over the woman's body. She was breathing, but barely. Shallow gasps that seemed to take tremendous effort. Her skin was hot and dry, her pulse rapid, and thready when he found it at her wrist. Classic signs of severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. The children were in better shape, but not by much. Their clothes were soaked with sweat, their lips chapped and white with salt deposits. "Hey," Jake said softly, touching the woman's shoulder. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, brown and unfocused, struggling to find his face in the harsh desert light. When she finally managed to look at him, Jake felt something twist in his chest. There was intelligence there, and desperation, and a love so fierce it seemed to burn despite her critical condition. "Miss Hijas," she whispered, her voice like sandpaper against stone. "My daughters, please." The twins stirred at the sound of their mother's voice, two identical faces turning toward Jake with wide, dark eyes that held too much knowledge for children so young. They were beautiful despite their condition, with their mother's delicate features and long eyelashes that belonged in a magazine advertisement. One of them was wearing the pink t-shirt he had spotted through his binoculars, decorated with a faded unicorn that had seen better days. The other wore a yellow dress that had once been bright but was now dulled with dust and wear. Neither of them cried, though Jake could see the fear and exhaustion etched in their small faces. "It's okay," Jake said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the woman or the children or himself. "I'm going to help you. What's your name?" "Carmen," the woman breathed, each word seeming to cost her precious energy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Carmen Vasquez. These are Sophia and Isabella. They're good. Girls, so good. Jake nodded, his mind racing through options and finding precious few. He was miles from the nearest road, even farther from medical help. Thunder was injured and couldn't carry much additional weight, especially not in his current condition. Jake had water in his canteens, maybe enough for a day if they were careful, but these people needed immediate medical attention that he simply couldn't provide. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. 3 days, Carmen said, and Jake felt his heart sink into his boots. 3 days in the desert without adequate water was a death sentence, especially for someone her size. The fact that she was still conscious was a miracle. The fact that the children were still alive was beyond miraculous. "Where were you trying to go?" Jake asked gently, tilting his canteen to Carmen's lips. She managed a few small sips before turning her head away, her body rejecting even the life-giving water it desperately needed. "Phoenix," she said, her voice gaining a little strength from the moisture. "My sister, she has work for me, cleaning offices at night, good money. The girls could go to school, learn English properly." Jake understood without her having to explain the rest. Carmen was undocumented, traveling with a coyote who had probably abandoned them when the going got tough, or maybe taken their money and left them to die when they couldn't keep up. It was a story he had heard too many times during his years. In the borderlands, each one a tragedy of dreams destroyed by greed and indifference. Thunder whinnied softly behind him, the horse's instincts picking up on the gravity of the situation. Jake turned to see the Mustang standing patiently, despite his injured hoof, his dark eyes watching the proceedings with the intelligence that had made him such a good companion over the years. "Okay," Jake said, turning back to Carmen and trying to project more confidence than he felt. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to hang on, okay? I need you to keep fighting." Carmen's hand found his wrist, her fingers cold despite the rising heat of the day. "If something happens to me," she said, her voice gaining strength from somewhere deep inside, "promise me you'll take care of them. Promise me they won't go back to what we left behind." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Jake said automatically, but Carmen's grip tightened with surprising strength. "Promise me," she repeated, and there was steel in her voice now, the kind of determination that could move mountains or cross deserts with 2 small children in tow. "These girls, they deserve better than what the world has given them so far." Jake looked at the twins, Sophia and Isabella, watching this exchange with the wide-eyed solemnity of children who had seen too much too soon. He thought about Rebecca, about the babies they had tried to have, about the empty house waiting for him somewhere in his past. He thought about promises and the weight they carried, especially promises made to dying women in the middle of nowhere. "I promise," he said, and meant it more than he had meant anything in years. Carmen smiled then, the first genuine expression of peace he had seen on her face. "Gracias," she whispered. "You are a good man. I can see it in your eyes. You understand what it means to lose everything." Jake tried to give her more water, but she was too weak to drink much. The twins managed a few sips each from his second canteen, and Jake tried not to think about how little he had left. He needed to make a decision, and he needed to make it fast. The temperature was still climbing toward its murderous peak, and every minute they stayed in the open desert increased the chances that none of them would survive. The problem was distance and weight. Thunder could carry 1 adult and maybe 1 child safely, even with his injured hoof. But that would mean leaving 2 people behind in the desert heat, and Jake knew that would be a death sentence. He had to find another way. Jake stood up and surveyed their surroundings with new eyes, looking for anything that might help. The Joshua tree provided some shade, but not enough for the heat that was coming. There was no water source visible, no sign of human habitation, but there was something else, something that sparked an idea born of desperation and hope. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a cluster of barrel cactus, Jake could see what looked like the remains of an old prospector's camp. A few pieces of weathered wood, some rusted metal, and what might have been the frame of a primitive cart or sled. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. "I'll be right back," Jake told Carmen and the twins. "Stay in the shade." He jogged over to the abandoned campsite, Thunder following at his own pace, favoring his injured hoof. The camp was older than Jake had first thought, probably from the 1920s or 1930s, when prospectors still roamed the desert looking for silver and gold. Most of the equipment was too corroded to be useful, but the cart frame was solid wood and metal, designed to be pulled by a mule or burro over rough terrain. Working quickly, Jake began stripping usable materials from the abandoned equipment. The cart's wheels were long gone, but the frame was intact and the right size to carry 2 adults and 2 children if he could figure out how to convert it into a travois. He had rope in his saddlebags, and Thunder was strong enough to pull a reasonable load even with his injury. It took him 20 minutes to fashion a crude but functional travois from the old cart frame and his climbing rope. The result wasn't pretty, but it would allow Thunder to drag all 4 of them toward help instead of leaving anyone behind. Jake tested the construction by pulling it himself, making sure the knots would hold and the weight distribution was reasonable. When 18, he returned to the Joshua tree. He found Carmen barely conscious and the twins holding her hands, their small faces streaked with tears they were trying not to shed. The temperature was climbing relentlessly, and Jake knew they were running out of time. "I'm going to put you on this," he told Carmen, indicating the travois. "It's going to be rough, but it's the only way I can get all of you out of here together." Carmen nodded weakly, understanding the necessity even through her delirium. Jake lifted her as gently as he could, amazed again at how light she felt, how fragile her body had become. He settled her on the makeshift stretcher and helped the twins climb on beside her, arranging them so they could hold on to the frame and each other during the journey ahead. Thunder stood patiently while Jake rigged the travois to his saddle, the horse seeming to understand the gravity of their situation. When everything was secured, Jake mounted up and looked back at his passengers. Carmen's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but steady. The twins were watching him with a mixture of trust and terror that made his chest ache. "Hold on tight," Jake said. "We're going to get you help." The journey that followed was the longest and most difficult of Jake's life. Thunder moved as smoothly as he could manage with his injured hoof, but the desert terrain was unforgiving. Every rock and dip in the ground translated into jarring motion for the travois passengers. Jake stopped frequently to check on them, to give them sips of his dwindling water supply, to adjust their position on the improvised stretcher. Carmen drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride, sometimes mumbling in Spanish, sometimes reaching out to touch her daughter's faces with trembling fingers. The twins endured the rough journey with the stoic courage that seemed to be their birthright, holding on to each other and their mother with small hands that never let go. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 90 minutes, Jake spotted something that made his heart leap with hope. A thin column of dust rising in the distance, moving parallel to their route. A vehicle on Highway 93, maybe a mile away across the desert floor. Jake urged Thunder into a faster pace, ignoring the horse's obvious discomfort. They had to reach. The highway had to flag down that vehicle before it disappeared into the vastness of Nevada. Behind him, he could hear Sophia and Isabella singing softly to their mother in Spanish, their young voices carrying an ancient lullaby across the empty desert. They reached the edge of the highway just as Jake's water ran out completely. Thunder was breathing hard, favoring his injured hoof more severely now, but the brave Mustang had carried them to safety. Jake dismounted and helped his passengers off the travois, settling them in whatever shade he could find beside the asphalt ribbon that connected civilization to civilization. Carmen was unconscious now, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. The twins sat beside her, their small hands still holding hers, their dark eyes watching the empty highway with the patience of children who had learned to wait for miracles. In the distance, Jake could hear the sound of an approaching vehicle, the first traffic he had seen since beginning this desperate journey. He stood up beside the highway and began waving his arms, praying that whoever was driving would stop, would help, would somehow make this nightmare end with something other than tragedy. As the vehicle drew closer, a white pickup truck with Nevada plates. Jake felt Carmen's hand slip into his pocket, pressing something small and folded against his palm. He looked down to see her eyes open one last time, focusing on his face with tremendous effort. "Read it," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the approaching truck. "When you're ready, read it. Everything will make sense." The pickup truck was slowing down, its driver no doubt wondering about the strange scene on the side of Highway 93. Jake clutched the folded paper Carmen had given him, feeling its weight like a promise he didn't yet understand. Behind him, Thunder stood patiently despite his injury, the makeshift travois still attached to his saddle, like evidence of a miracle in progress. But even as Jake prepared to flag down their rescuers, even as he readied himself to explain the impossible situation to strangers, he knew that his life had just changed forever. Carmen Vasquez was dying in the Nevada desert, but she had left him something more precious than her last breath. She had left him responsibility, purpose, and 2 little girls who would need someone to fight for them in a world that had already shown them too much cruelty. The folded paper in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, though Jake wouldn't read it until much later. When he finally did, he would discover that Carmen had written more than just her dying wishes. She had written a confession, a secret and a truth that would reshape everything Jake thought he knew about his past, his present and his future. But that revelation was still hours away. For now, there was only the desert, the heat, 2 frightened children, and a man who had just promised a dying woman that he would change his life to save theirs. The pickup truck was pulling over, its driver stepping out into the blazing sun, and Jake took a deep breath and prepared to explain the unexplainable, to ask for help he wasn't sure he deserved, and to begin a journey that would transform all of them in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The white pickup truck belonged to Maria Santos, a nurse heading home from her night shift at Valley General Hospital in Las Vegas. She had been driving Highway 93 for 12 years and had never seen anything like the scene that greeted her when she pulled over. A man on horseback with an injured Mustang, a makeshift travois constructed from what looked like old mining equipment, and 3 people who appeared to be dying of heat exposure in the middle of the Nevada desert. Maria's medical training kicked in immediately. She assessed the situation with the cool efficiency of someone who had seen trauma before, but even her experienced eyes widened when she realized what Jake had accomplished. Getting 3 people across miles of desert terrain, with nothing but an injured horse and improvised equipment, wasn't just remarkable, it was miraculous. "How long have they been without water?" Maria asked as she knelt beside Carmen, her fingers finding the woman's pulse while her eyes evaluated skin tone and responsiveness. 3 days, maybe more, Jake replied, his voice hoarse from dehydration and stress. "I found them about 4 hours ago. The woman's name is Carmen Vasquez, and these are her daughters, Sophia and Isabella." Maria nodded grimly as she opened her medical kit. As a trauma nurse, she had seen enough dehydration cases to know that Carmen was in critical condition. The twins were in better shape, but all three needed immediate IV fluids and emergency care that could only be provided at a hospital. "We need to get them to Valley General immediately," Maria said, already reaching for her satellite phone. Unlike regular cell phones, the satellite device worked even in the remote desert areas where they found themselves. "I'm calling for a helicopter. Airlift." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him as Maria spoke rapidly into the phone, providing coordinates and medical assessments to the emergency dispatcher. Professional help was finally coming. But even as he watched Maria work with practiced efficiency, Jake couldn't shake the weight of the folded paper in his pocket, the final gift Carmen had pressed into his hand. The helicopter arrived 37 minutes later, its rotors creating a sandstorm that forced everyone to shield their eyes and move the patients to a safer distance. The flight paramedics worked with swift precision, establishing IV lines and monitoring vital signs while they loaded Carmen and the twins into the aircraft. Jake watched from the ground as the helicopter lifted off, carrying away 3 people, who had become his responsibility in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Follow me to the hospital," Maria called over the fading sound of the helicopter rotors. "You look like you could use some medical attention yourself." Jake nodded, though his first concern was thunder. The Mustang had given everything he had to carry them to safety, and the injured hoof needed proper treatment. Maria seemed to read his thoughts and pointed to a horse trailer attached to her pickup truck. "I breed quarter horses on weekends," she explained. "Your Mustang can ride in comfort while you get checked out by the doctors." The 3-hour drive to Las Vegas passed in a blur of desert highways and worried silence. Jake found himself staring at the hospital helicopter in the distance, wondering if Carmen would survive the flight, wondering what would happen to Sophia and Isabella if she didn't. He had made a promise to a dying woman, but he had no idea how to keep it. He was a drifter with no permanent address, no steady income, no family of his own. How could he possibly care for 2 young children? Valley General Hospital was a sprawling complex of gleaming buildings and manicured lawns that seemed impossibly clean and modern after days in the desert. Jake felt out of place in his dusty clothes and sun-beaten appearance, but the emergency room staff treated him with the same professional courtesy they showed everyone who walked through their doors. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician, was a woman in her early 50s, with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She examined Jake thoroughly, checking for signs of heat exhaustion and dehydration, while asking detailed questions about the rescue. "You saved their lives," Dr. Walsh said, as she finished her examination. "Another few hours in that heat, and we would have been planning funerals instead of treatment plans." "How is Carmen?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. Dr. Walsh's expression grew serious. "She's in critical condition. The dehydration has stressed her kidneys and cardiovascular system severely. We're doing everything we can, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Her condition is very grave. You should prepare yourself for the possibility that she might not survive." Jake felt something heavy settle in his chest. He had known. Carmen was dying when he found her, but hearing it from a doctor made it feel final in a way that hope couldn't overcome. "What about the girls?" he asked. "Sophia and Isabella are responding well to treatment," Dr. Walsh said, her expression brightening slightly. "Children are remarkably resilient. They should make a full recovery with proper care and nutrition." "And then, what happens to them?" Dr. Walsh hesitated. "That depends on several factors. Do they have family members who can care for them? Are they documented immigrants? The Social Services Department will need to conduct a thorough investigation before making any placement decisions." Jake thought about Carmen's desperate words, about not wanting her daughters to go back to whatever they had fled. He thought about his promise, and about the mysterious letter still folded in his pocket. "I'd like to see them," he said. Dr. Walsh nodded. They're in the pediatric ward, room 314. But I should warn you, they don't speak much English, and they're frightened. They keep asking for their mother. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt like it took forever. Jake had no idea what he would say to Sophia and Isabella, how he could possibly comfort 2 little girls who had just lost everything they had ever known. He found himself thinking about Rebecca, about the children they had planned to have, about the nursery they had started to decorate before cancer stole their future away. Room 314 was a cheerful space painted in soft pastels with cartoon characters. On the walls, Sophia and Isabella were sharing a single bed, curled together in a way that reminded Jake painfully of how he had found them in the desert. They looked impossibly small in the hospital gowns, their dark hair clean now but still, bearing the hollow-eyed look of children who had seen too much. "Hola?" Jake said softly from the doorway, exhausting nearly his entire Spanish vocabulary with that single word. Both girls looked up at him with recognition dawning in their dark eyes. Sophia, the one who had been wearing the pink unicorn shirt, whispered something to her sister in rapid Spanish. Isabella, slightly older and apparently the spokesperson for the pair, sat up straighter in the bed. "You are the man with the horse," Isabella said in careful English, her accent thick but her words clear. "You saved us." Jake stepped into the room, his throat tight with emotion. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Isabella replied. "The doctors gave us water and food, but we want to see our mama." Jake sat down in the chair beside their bed, struggling to find words that wouldn't destroy what little hope they had left. "Your mama is very sick," he said finally. "The doctors are taking care of her. Will she die like Papa did?" Sophia asked, speaking English for the first time since Jake had met her. Her voice was so small and frightened that Jake felt his heart break a little more. "I don't know," Jake said honestly, "but I want you to know that no matter what happens, you're not alone. I made a promise to your mama that I would take care of you." Both girls stared at him with the serious expressions of children forced to grow up too fast. Isabella reached under her pillow and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed Carmen with a man Jake didn't recognize, both of them smiling and holding infant twins. "This is our papa," Isabella said. "He died when the bad men came to our village. Mama said we had to leave or they would hurt us too." Jake studied the photograph, noting the happiness in Carmen's face, the protective way the man held his daughters. This was the life they had fled from, the danger Carmen had been so desperate to escape. "Your mama was very brave," Jake said. "She brought you all this way to keep you safe. Are you going to keep us safe now?" Sophia asked, and the trust in her voice was almost more than Jake could bear. Before he could answer, there was a soft knock on the door. Dr. Walsh entered, her expression grave. She glanced meaningfully at the children, then back at Jake. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" she asked. Jake's stomach dropped. He knew what that expression meant, had seen it on too many doctors' faces during Rebecca's illness. He followed Dr. Walsh into the hallway, his legs feeling unsteady. "I'm sorry," Dr. Walsh said quietly. "Carmen passed away 20 minutes ago. We did everything we could, but the damage from dehydration was too extensive. Her organs simply couldn't recover." Jake leaned against the wall, closing his eyes as the weight of this new reality settled on him. Carmen Vasquez was dead, and he was now responsible for 2 orphaned children in a foreign country with no legal status and no family to claim them. "Have you told the girls yet?" Jake asked. "No, I wanted to speak with you first. Given your connection to this situation, I thought you might want to be present when we break the news." Jake nodded, though he had no idea how to help 2 little girls process the loss of their mother. He thought about the letter in his pocket, Carmen's final words, about everything making sense. Maybe it was time to read whatever message she had left for him. "Could you give me a few minutes?" Jake asked. "There's something I need to do first." "Doctor Walsh nodded understandingly. "Take all the time you need. This is never easy, especially with children so young." Jake found a quiet corner in the hospital chapel, a small interfaith space with simple wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the floor. He pulled Carmen's letter from his pocket with trembling hands, unfolding the paper carefully. The writing was in Spanish, which he couldn't read, but there was also a section in heavily accented English, written in the same careful handwriting. 2. "The good man who finds this letter," the English section began. "My name is Carmen Maria Vasquez, and if you are reading this, then I am probably dead, and my daughters are alone in the world. I pray that God has sent someone with a kind heart to help them." Jake's hands shook as he continued reading. The letter went on to describe the violence that had driven Carmen and her daughters from their village in Guatemala, the death of her husband at the hands of gang members, and her desperate journey north in search of safety and opportunity. But it was the final paragraph that made Jake's world tilt on its axis. "There is something else you must know," Carmen had written. "My husband's name was Roberto Vasquez, but that was not his real name. His real name was Roberto Morrison. He was American, a teacher who came to our village with the Peace Corps many years ago. He never left. Sophia and Isabella are not just my daughters, they are American citizens by birth, and if my husband told me the truth about his family, they may have relatives in America who do not know they exist. His brother's name was David Morrison, and he lived in California. Roberto said they had not spoken in many years because of a fight about Roberto's choice to stay in Guatemala. But maybe, if something happened to me, David would help his brothers. Children, maybe you could find him. Maybe my girls could have a real family after all." Jake read the letter 3 times before the full impact of what he was learning began to sink in. Roberto Morrison, David Morrison. Could it be possible that these 2 little girls were somehow related to him? Jake's brother David had joined the Peace Corps right after college, had disappeared into Central America for several years before returning to become a high school teacher in California. They had lost touch after a bitter argument about David's decision to stay abroad longer than planned, an argument that now seemed impossibly petty in light of what Jake was discovering. David Morrison had been Jake's younger brother, the idealistic one who wanted to save the world, while Jake focused on practical concerns like making a living and building a life with Rebecca. They had grown apart over the years, their communication reduced to occasional Christmas cards and awkward phone calls. Jake didn't even know if David was still alive, let alone where he might be living. But if Carmen's letter was telling the truth, if Roberto Morrison had been David, then Sophia and Isabella weren't just 2 orphaned children he had rescued from the desert. They were his nieces, his family, the children he and Rebecca had never been able to have, delivered to him through circumstances too strange and tragic to be anything but fate. Jake sat in the chapel for a long time, staring at Carmen's letter and trying to process the implications of what he had learned. The girls were American citizens, which meant they wouldn't be deported or lost in the immigration system. But they were also his responsibility now, not just because of a promise made to a dying woman, but because they were blood relatives who had no one else in the world. When he finally returned to room 314, he found Sophia and Isabella sitting up, in bed, holding hands and whispering to each other in Spanish. They looked up at him with expectant faces, and Jake realized that Dr. Walsh had been waiting for him to return before delivering the devastating news about their mother. "Girls," Jake said softly, sitting down in the chair beside their bed, "I need to tell you something very important about your mama." Both children seemed to understand what was coming. Their small faces grew solemn, and Sophia moved closer to her sister for comfort. "Your mama was very, very sick," Jake continued, his voice gentle but clear. "The doctors tried their best to help her, but she was too hurt from being in the desert. She died a little while ago." Isabella nodded with the grave acceptance of a child who had already lost too much. "We knew she was going to die," she said, quietly. "She told us in the desert that she might not make it, but that we had to be strong." Sophia began to cry then, soft tears that she tried to wipe away with the back of her hand. Isabella put her arm around her sister and spoke to her in Spanish, words of comfort that Jake couldn't understand, but recognized as the kind of strength that ran in families. "But there's something else," Jake said, pulling Carmen's letter from his pocket. "Your mama left me a letter, and in it she told me something very important about your papa." Both girls looked at him with renewed attention, their tears temporarily forgotten. "Your papa's real name was Roberto Morrison," Jake continued, watching their faces carefully. "That means his last name was the same as mine. I think your papa might have been my brother." The words sounded impossible even as he spoke them, but the more Jake thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit. The timeline matched. David had been in Guatemala during the right years. He had always been the type to fall in love with a place and its people, to choose heart over practicality. "You are our tío?" Isabella asked, using the Spanish word for uncle. "Our family?" "I think I might be," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think your papa was my little brother. And I think that means you girls are my family now." Sophia stopped crying and stared at him with wide eyes. "Mama always said that God would send someone to take care of us," she whispered. "She said family would find us when we needed them most." Jake felt tears threatening his own eyes as he looked at these two brave little girls who had lost everything but still found the strength to hope. He thought about Carmen Vasquez, dying in the desert, but using her last breath to ensure her daughters would be safe. He thought about promises and responsibility and the strange ways that life could reshape itself when you least expected it. "Yes," he said finally, reaching out to take both their small hands in his. "I'm going to take care of you. We're going to be a family." The social worker arrived an hour later, a tired-looking woman with a clipboard full of forms and questions that would determine the girl's immediate future. But Jake had Carmen's letter, and he had a story that was beginning to make sense, even as it transformed his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his past. The road ahead would be complicated. There would be legal proceedings, DNA tests, background checks, and 1,000 bureaucratic hurdles to navigate. But Jake Morrison was no longer a drifter with no purpose, no future, and no hope. He was an uncle who had found his brother's children in the vast emptiness of the desert, guided by the love of a dying woman who had trusted a stranger with her most precious gift. Outside the hospital window, Thunder was being treated by a veterinarian in Maria Santos's horse trailer, his injured hoof wrapped and healing. Soon, Jake would take his new family back into the world, back to the business of living and building a future together. But first, there were tears to shed, stories to share, and the beginning of understanding that sometimes the people we lose lead us to the people we're meant to find. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 6 weeks after Jake Morrison had pulled 2 dying children from the Nevada desert. The official envelope from the laboratory felt impossibly light in his hands, considering how much weight its contents would carry for the rest of their lives. Jake sat in the cramped waiting room of the Clark County Family Services office, Sophia and Isabella flanking him on plastic chairs that had seen better decades, while caseworker Linda Chen reviewed the documents that would determine their future. "Well," Linda said, looking up from the papers with the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her in weeks of bureaucratic meetings, "it's official. DNA confirms that Roberto Vasquez was indeed David Morrison, your brother. Sophia and Isabella Morrison are your biological nieces and American citizens by birth." Jake felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. The past 6 weeks had been a maze of temporary foster placements, supervised visits, background checks, and legal proceedings that seemed designed to separate families rather than unite them. But now they had scientific proof of what Jake's heart had known from the moment he read Carmen's letter. Sophia looked up at him with questioning eyes. At 6 years old, she understood that the adults had been making important decisions about her life, but the concept of DNA testing was beyond her grasp. Isabella, slightly older and fiercely protective of her twin, had appointed herself the interpreter for these complicated adult conversations. "What does this mean?" Isabella asked in her careful English, which had improved dramatically during their time in the foster system. "Can we stay with Tio Jake now?" Linda Chen's expression grew more serious as she consulted another stack of forms. "The biological relationship has been established, but there are still several steps in the custody process. Mr. Morrison, you'll need to complete parenting classes, undergo a psychological evaluation, and pass a home inspection before we can approve permanent placement." Jake nodded, though inside he was screaming at the bureaucratic machinery that seemed determined to keep him separated from his brother's children. The girls had been staying with Maria Santos, the nurse who had helped rescue them, while Jake navigated the legal requirements for custody. Maria had been kind and patient, but Jake could see the strain in Sophia and Isabella's faces every time he had to leave them at the end of a supervised visit. "How long will all this take?" Jake asked, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "If everything goes smoothly, we could have preliminary custody approved within 60 days, Linda replied. "But I have to be honest with you, Mr. Morrison. Your living situation is unconventional. You're essentially homeless, moving from job to job with no permanent address. The court will need to see stability before they'll approve placement." Of 2 young children, Jake understood the concern, but it felt like another impossible barrier in an already overwhelming process. For the past 3 years, since Rebecca's death, he had deliberately avoided putting down roots anywhere. The pain of losing her had made the idea of home feel like a trap, a place where memories could corner you and tear you apart. But now he had 2 little girls who needed exactly what he had been running from: stability, consistency, and a place to call home. "I've been thinking about that," Jake said carefully. "I have some money saved up, and I've been looking at properties in the area. Nothing fancy, but somewhere the girls could have their own rooms, maybe a yard to play in. It wasn't entirely true yet, but it wasn't a lie either." Jake had been researching real estate options between legal meetings, trying to figure out how to transform himself from a drifter into a responsible guardian. The insurance money from Rebecca's death was still sitting in a bank account, untouched for 3 years, because spending it had felt like betraying her memory somehow. But maybe Rebecca would have understood that her death benefits could help give life to 2 children who had lost everything. "That would certainly help your case," Linda said, making notes on her clipboard. "The court likes to see concrete plans for housing, education, and childcare. Speaking of which, have you given any thought to schooling? The girls will need to be enrolled as soon as custody is finalized." Jake looked at Sophia and Isabella, who were listening to this conversation with the serious attention of children, whose lives had been subject to adult decisions beyond their control for too long. They had been through so much already, losing their father to violence, fleeing their home country, watching their mother die in the desert. The last thing they needed was more uncertainty about their future. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, reaching over to squeeze Isabella's hand. "Whatever they need, we'll make it work." The drive back to Maria Santos's house was quiet, the girls lost in their own thoughts while Jake wrestled with the magnitude of what he was taking on. He had gone from being a solitary man with no responsibilities to being the sole guardian of 2 traumatized children who spoke limited English and had never experienced American culture beyond hospital rooms and government offices. Maria was waiting for them on her front porch, her expression hopeful as she watched Jake help the girls out of his newly purchased Honda Accord. He had traded in his old motorcycle for something more family-appropriate, another small step in his transformation from bachelor drifter to responsible adult. "Good news, I hope?" Maria asked as they climbed the steps to her modest ranch house. "The DNA confirmed it," Jake said, unable to keep the relief out of his voice. "They're my brother's daughters. Now we just have to convince the court that I can take care of them properly." Maria nodded knowingly. As a nurse who had worked with many families in crisis, she understood the bureaucratic challenges that lay ahead. "Come inside. I made lunch and I have something I want to discuss with you." The girls ran ahead into the house, comfortable now in Maria's home after 6 weeks of temporary placement. They had their own bedroom here, decorated with stuffed animals and children's books that Maria had purchased to help them feel welcome. Jake followed more slowly, his mind still processing the morning's revelations and the tasks that lay ahead. Over sandwiches and homemade soup, Maria outlined an idea that took Jake completely by surprise. "I've been thinking about your housing situation," she said, glancing meaningfully at Sophia and Isabella, who were engrossed in coloring books at the kitchen table. "My late husband left me this house, but it's really too big for one person. The master suite is completely separate from the rest of the house, with its own entrance. It could be perfect for a small family." Jake stared at her, not sure he understood what she was suggesting. "Are you offering to rent me part of your house?" "I'm offering to help," Maria said simply. "Those girls have been through enough disruption. They're comfortable here, they know the neighborhood, and they've already started making friends with the children next door. Why uproot them again when we could just expand the family?" It was an incredibly generous offer, but Jake felt uncomfortable accepting more charity. He had already been dependent on Maria's kindness for 6 weeks, and the idea of becoming a permanent burden felt wrong. "I appreciate the offer," Jake said carefully, "but I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Maria interrupted. "I'm offering, and before you get all proud and stubborn about it, think about what's best for Sophia and Isabella. They need stability, and they need it now. This could be a perfect transition situation while you get your feet under you as a guardian." Isabella looked up from her coloring book, her dark eyes moving between the two adults as she tried to follow the conversation. "Are we going to live here with Tia Maria?" she asked, using the Spanish term for aunt that had become her nickname for their temporary guardian. "Would you like that?" Jake asked, curious about the girls' preferences in a situation where they had so little control. Both girls nodded enthusiastically. Sophia, who was still working on her English, but understood far more than she could express, pointed to the backyard where Maria's 2 cats were sunning themselves on the patio. "Gatos," Sophia said, then corrected herself. "Cats. I like the cats." Jake realized that he had been thinking about this situation from his own perspective, his need for independence, his discomfort with accepting help, his desire to prove that he could handle single parenthood on his own. But the girls had different needs, and their emotional well-being should be his priority, not his pride. "If you're sure about this," Jake said to Maria, "maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement. I could pay rent, help with expenses, take on some of the household responsibilities." Maria's smile was radiant. "I think that sounds perfect. The girls can keep their room, you can have the master suite, and we can share the common areas. It'll be like having the family I never had." The arrangement proved to be more successful than anyone had anticipated. Within 2 weeks, they had established routines that worked for everyone. Jake took over the grocery shopping and most of the cooking, discovering that he actually enjoyed preparing meals for people who appreciated them. Maria helped with childcare and translation when the girls needed to communicate something beyond their English vocabulary. The house that had felt too empty for one person became perfectly sized for their improvised family of 4. The girls flourished in ways that amazed everyone who knew their story. Isabella's English improved dramatically with constant practice, and she appointed herself as Sophia's translator and cultural guide. Sophia remained more reserved, but her personality began to emerge as she felt safer in her new environment. She had an artist's eye for color and detail, spending hours creating elaborate drawings that covered every surface of the refrigerator and most of the walls in their shared bedroom. Jake found himself adapting to parenthood with surprising ease. The structure that the girls required gave his own life a stability he hadn't realized he was missing. He enrolled in the required parenting classes, where he learned about child development, trauma response, and the specific needs of children who had experienced loss and displacement. The other participants were mostly divorced parents or grandparents taking on unexpected custody, and Jake's story of desert rescue and family discovery made him something of a celebrity in the group. The psychological evaluation was more challenging. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a child psychologist who specialized in custody cases, asked probing questions about Jake's grief process, his readiness for parenthood, and his understanding of the girl's cultural and linguistic needs. These children have experienced significant trauma, Dr. Reeves explained during one of their sessions. They've lost their father to violence, their mother to illness, and their entire cultural context. You're asking them to adapt not just to a new guardian, but to a completely different way of life. Jake nodded, understanding the complexity of what they were all navigating. I'm not trying to replace their parents or erase their heritage, he said. I just want to give them safety and stability while they figure out who they're going to become. And what about your own healing? Dr. Reeves asked. You've experienced significant loss as well. How do you plan to manage your own grief while supporting theirs? It was a question Jake had been avoiding, but he knew it was important. I think maybe helping them has helped me too, he said slowly. For the first time in 3 years, I have a reason to get up in the morning that isn't just about surviving another day. Dr. Reeves made notes on her legal pad, her expression thoughtful. The girls seem to have attached to you quite strongly, she observed. Isabella, in particular, shows signs of appointing herself as a caretaker for both you and her sister. That's common in children who have experienced loss, but it's something to monitor as they adjust. Jake had noticed Isabella's protective instincts, the way she positioned herself between Sophia and any potential threat, the way she watched his face for signs of distress or impatience. It broke his heart to realize that a 6-year-old felt responsible for managing the emotions of the adults around her. What can I do to help her feel more secure? Jake asked. Consistency, Dr. Reeves replied. But predictable routines, clear expectations, and reassurance that caring for Sophia is your job, not hers. She needs permission to be a child again. The home inspection was the final hurdle, and Jake was nervous as he watched the social worker evaluate every aspect of their living situation. The house was clean and well-maintained. The girls' room was cheerfully decorated with appropriate furniture and toys, and Maria's presence provided an additional layer of security and supervision that clearly impressed the inspector. This is quite unusual, the social worker admitted as she completed her report. Most single guardians don't have this level of support built into their living situation. The girls seem very comfortable here, and Mr. Morrison appears to have developed appropriate parenting skills remarkably quickly. 2 weeks later, Jake received the call he had been hoping for since that September morning in the government office. Preliminary custody had been approved. Sophia and Isabella Morrison were officially his wards, and he was officially their legal guardian. The celebration was small, but meaningful. Maria made the girls' favorite dinner, chicken enchiladas with rice and beans, while Jake tried to explain to Sophia and Isabella what the court's decision meant for their future. Does this mean we don't have to go to any more offices with the lady who asks lots of questions? Isabella wanted to know. That's exactly what it means, Jake confirmed. You live here now with me and Tia Maria, and nobody is going to take you away." Sophia, who had been quietly coloring throughout the conversation, looked up with a question that caught Jake off guard. "Will you be our papa now?" Jake felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I'll be whatever you need me to be," he said carefully. "I'm your uncle, but if you want to call me papa, that's okay too." Isabella considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. "I think we will call you Tio Papa," she announced, "because you are both." That night, after the girls were asleep in their shared bedroom, Jake sat on Maria's back patio with a beer and tried to process how completely his life had changed in just 3 months. Thunder was grazing in the small pasture behind the house, his injured hoof fully healed and his coat gleaming with good health. The horse had adapted to suburban life as successfully as Jake had adapted to parenthood, proving that even the most independent creatures could learn to be part of a family. Jake pulled Carmen's letter from his wallet, where he had carried it every day since reading it in the hospital chapel. The paper was worn soft from handling, but the words were still clearly visible in the porch light. "Thank you," he whispered to the desert wind, speaking to a woman who had trusted a stranger with her most precious gift. "I'll take care of them, I promise." Inside the house, he could hear Maria washing dishes and humming quietly to herself, the sound of someone who was no longer lonely. Through the window, he could see the girls' bedroom, where Sophia had fallen asleep surrounded by her art supplies, and Isabella had positioned herself protectively between her sister and the door, even in sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. School enrollment, doctor's appointments, the ongoing work of helping 2 traumatized children learn to trust the world again. But tonight, Jake Morrison was no longer a drifter, with no purpose and no hope. He was Tio Papa to 2 little girls, who had survived the unthinkable and chosen to love again. He was part of a family that had been born in the desert heat and forged in the crucible of bureaucracy and determination. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer empty. They would build it together, one day at a time, one small victory at a time, until the children who had lost everything became the women who could survive anything. And Jake would be there for all of it, keeping the promise he had made to a dying woman under the merciless Nevada sun. The phone call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Friday in November, 6 months after Jake Morrison had become the legal guardian of Sophia and Isabella. The shrill ring cut through the peaceful silence of Maria's house like a blade, jerking Jake from the deepest sleep he'd had in weeks. He fumbled for the phone on his nightstand, his heart already racing with the parents' instinctive fear that late-night calls brought bad news about children. "Is this Jake Morrison?" The voice was male, heavily accented and unfamiliar. "Yes, who is this?" Jake sat up in bed, instantly alert. "My name is Detective Carlos Herrera, Las Vegas Metro Police. I'm calling about Carmen Vasquez. I understand you were involved in her case earlier this year." Jake's blood turned cold. Carmen had been dead for 6 months. What could the police possibly want with her case now? "Yes, I found her and her daughters in the desert. What's this about?" "Sir, I need to ask you some questions about Carmen's background, specifically about her relationship with Roberto Vasquez. Can you come down to the station this morning?" Jake glanced at his alarm clock, calculating how long he had before Sophia and Isabella would wake up for school. "Is there some kind of problem? I thought the case was closed." Detective Herrera's voice carried a weight that made Jake's stomach clench. "Sir, we've had some new developments that suggest Carmen Vasquez's death may not have been as straightforward as we initially believed. There are some things about her past that we need to discuss." An hour later, Jake sat in a sterile interview room at the Las Vegas Police Department, drinking bitter coffee from a paper cup, while Detective Herrera spread photographs and documents. Across the metal table between them, the detective was a thin man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much human suffering. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear," Herrera began, "but we've been investigating a human trafficking ring that operates between Central America and the southwestern United States. Carmen Vasquez's name came up in our investigation." Jake felt the world tilt slightly. Human trafficking? Carmen was fleeing violence with her children. She wasn't involved in anything criminal. "We don't think she was a perpetrator," Herrera clarified quickly, "but we have evidence that suggests she may have been a victim, and more importantly, that the people she was running from may still be looking for her children." The detective slid a photograph across the table. It showed a group of men standing beside several trucks in what looked like a warehouse. Jake didn't recognize any of the faces, but something about the image made his skin crawl. "This was taken at a compound outside Guatemala City 2 months ago," Herrera explained. "The man in the center is Miguel Santos, the leader of a cartel that specializes in kidnapping families and forcing them to carry drugs across the border. We believe Carmen's husband Roberto was killed because he refused to cooperate with their operation." Jake stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. "You're saying Carmen was forced to smuggle drugs?" "We think the plan was to use her as a mule, with the children as leverage to ensure her cooperation. But something went wrong. Maybe she escaped, maybe she never made contact with her handlers in Phoenix. Either way, she ended up in the desert dying of dehydration instead of delivering a shipment of heroin to distributors in Las Vegas." The implications of what Herrera was telling him began to sink in like stones thrown into dark water. "Are you saying Sophia and Isabella could still be in danger?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Herrera replied grimly. "These people don't just write off their losses. If they think the children might know something about Roberto's activities, or if they believe the girls could be used to pressure other families into cooperation, they won't stop looking." Jake felt sick. For 6 months, he'd been focused on building a normal life for Sophia and Isabella, helping them heal from their trauma and adapt to American culture. The idea that their past was still hunting them, that dangerous people might be actively searching for 2 little girls who had already suffered so much, was almost unbearable. "What kind of protection can you offer?" Jake asked. Detective Herrera's expression was not encouraging. "Limited. We can increase patrols around your neighborhood, put a flag on your address in our system. But we don't have the resources for round-the-clock protection, especially when we're not certain there's an active threat." "Not certain?" Jake's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "You just told me that cartel members might be looking for my nieces, and you're not certain there's a threat." "We have no evidence that anyone knows where the children are," Herrera said carefully. "Carmen died using a false identity, and she never made contact with her handlers in Phoenix. As far as Miguel Santos knows, she and the children simply disappeared somewhere between Guatemala and Nevada." It was small comfort, but Jake clung to it like a lifeline. "So they might be safe?" "They might be," Herrera agreed. "But I wanted you to be aware of the situation so you could take appropriate precautions. Watch for anything unusual around your home or neighborhood. Be careful about the children's online presence. No social media posts with their faces or names. And if anything happens that makes you uncomfortable, anything at all, call me immediately." Jake drove home in a daze, his mind spinning with new fears and unwanted possibilities. How could he explain this to Maria? How could he keep Sophia and Isabella safe without destroying the sense of security they had just begun to develop? And most importantly, how could he protect them from threats he couldn't see or predict? Maria was waiting for him in the kitchen. When he arrived home, her face creased with worry. "The girls are at school," she said without preamble. "What did the police want?" Jake explained everything Detective Herrera had told him, watching Maria's expression grow more troubled with each detail. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, staring at her hands folded on the kitchen table. "Those poor babies," she said finally. "They've been through so much already. How much more can they be expected to endure?" "We don't know for certain that anyone is looking for them," Jake said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. The detective said there's no evidence that the cartel knows where they are. "But we can't take that chance," Maria replied firmly. "We need to make changes, take precautions. I've been in Las Vegas long enough to know how these criminal organizations operate. They have long memories and longer reach than most people realize. Over the following weeks, their household routine shifted in subtle but significant ways. Jake installed a security system with cameras covering all approaches to the house. Maria began varying her route to work and keeping a closer eye on their neighborhood for unfamiliar faces or vehicles. They explained to Sophia and Isabella that they needed to be extra careful about talking to strangers without revealing the specific reasons for their concern. The girls adapted to the new restrictions with the resilience that had carried them through every other challenge in their young lives, but Jake could see the strain beginning to show. Isabella became more watchful, more protective of her sister. Sophia's nightmares returned, and she started asking questions about her mother that she had stopped asking months earlier. "Tio Papa," Isabella said one evening while Jake was helping her with homework, "are the bad men from our village looking for us?" Jake's heart clenched. Despite their efforts to keep the children unaware of the potential threat, Isabella's sharp intelligence had picked up on the changes in their household atmosphere. "Why would you ask that?" Jake said carefully. "Sophia has been having dreams about the men who hurt Papa," Isabella replied, "and you and Tia Maria keep looking out the windows like you're watching for something. Are we in danger again?" Jake set down Isabella's math worksheets and looked into her dark eyes, seeing too much knowledge and too much fear for a child her age. He had promised Carmen that he would protect these girls, but protection meant more than just physical safety. It meant giving them the emotional security to be children again. "There might be some people who want to find you," Jake said honestly, "but they don't know where you are, and we're doing everything we can to keep you safe. That's why we have the new alarms, and why we're being extra careful." Isabella nodded solemnly. "Should I tell Sophia?" "Let me talk to her," Jake said. "But I want you to know that no matter what happens, you don't have to take care of everyone anymore. That's my job now." The conversation with Sophia was even more difficult. The younger twin had fewer words to express her fears, but her drawings had become increasingly dark and violent, filled with shadowy figures and scenes of pursuit. When Jake gently asked her about the nightmares, she dissolved into tears and refused to talk about them. It was Maria who finally broke through Sophia's silence, sitting with her in the backyard, while the little girl painted watercolor pictures of flowers and butterflies. "Your pictures are getting happier again," Maria observed. Sophia nodded and continued painting in careful, deliberate strokes. "I don't want to remember the bad things anymore," she said quietly. "But they keep coming back in my dreams." "Dreams can't hurt you," Maria said gently. "But if you want to talk about them, Tio Papa and I are always here to listen." "The bad men in my dreams look like the men who took Papa away," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Isabella says they might be looking for us. I don't want them to find us." Maria felt her heart break for this child, who had already endured more trauma than most adults ever would. "They won't find you," she said with quiet conviction. "There are too many people who love you and want to keep you safe." But even as Maria offered reassurance, she couldn't shake her own growing sense of unease. Working as a nurse in Las Vegas had exposed her to the city's darker underbelly, including the victims of cartel violence who sometimes arrived at the hospital with injuries that couldn't be explained by accidents or domestic disputes. She knew that Detective Herrera's warnings should be taken seriously. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jake had been researching security companies online when he stumbled across an article about a ranch in Montana that specialized in providing sanctuary for families fleeing domestic violence and organized crime. The facility, called Haven Ranch, offered secure housing, counseling services, and educational programs for children who needed to disappear from their previous lives while legal proceedings played out. "It's not permanent," Jake explained to Maria after showing her the website, "just until the police can determine whether there's a real threat. The girls could continue their education, get specialized counseling for their trauma, and we'd all be in a controlled environment where security is the primary concern." Maria studied the photographs of rolling grasslands, comfortable cabins, and smiling children engaged in various activities. "It looks peaceful," she admitted. But would Sophia and Isabella see it as another abandonment, another disruption in their lives? It was a valid concern. The girls had experienced enough upheaval to last several lifetimes, but Jake was increasingly convinced that staying in Las Vegas might expose them to risks that outweighed the benefits of maintaining their current routine. The decision was ultimately made for them when Detective Herrera called with news that changed everything. "We arrested 2 men yesterday who were asking questions about Carmen Vasquez and her daughters," he said without preamble. "They had photographs of the girls and your address." Jake felt the floor drop out from under him. "Where are they now?" "In custody, but they'll probably make bail within 48 hours, Herrera replied. "We can hold them on immigration violations, but we can't prove they intended any harm to your family. I strongly recommend that you consider relocating until we can build a stronger case against the organization they work for." That evening, Jake sat down with Sophia and Isabella to explain that they would be taking an extended vacation to a ranch in Montana, where other families went when they needed to be extra safe. He tried to frame it as an adventure, a chance to see mountains and learn to ride horses, but both girls understood that something serious was happening. "Are we running away again?" Isabella asked. "We're being smart," Jake replied. "Sometimes being smart means going somewhere safe while other people solve problems for us." Sophia, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, surprised everyone by speaking up with more clarity than she had shown in weeks. "Will Thunder come with us?" Jake smiled, touched that her first concern was for their 4-legged family member. "Yes, Thunder will come with us. The ranch has places for horses to live too." The preparations for leaving took 3 days, during which Jake marveled at how quickly their carefully constructed life could be packed into boxes and suitcases. Maria had decided to come with them, taking a leave of absence from the hospital to help maintain stability for the girls during yet another transition. On their last morning in Las Vegas, Jake stood in the backyard, watching Thunder graze while Sophia and Isabella said goodbye to Maria's cats. Detective Herrera had promised to keep them informed about the investigation, but there was no timeline for when it might be safe to return. "We're good at starting over," Isabella said, appearing beside him with her suitcase in hand. "We've done it before." Jake looked down at this remarkable child who had survived civil war, desert crossing, orphanhood, and now the threat of cartel pursuit, all before her 7th birthday. "Yes," he said, "we are very good at starting over, and we're good at taking care of each other too." As they loaded their belongings into the rented truck that would carry them to Montana, Jake reflected on how dramatically his life continued to evolve. 6 months ago, he had thought he was simply rescuing 3 strangers from the desert. Now he was fleeing across state lines to protect his family from forces he barely understood. But as he watched Sophia and Isabella help Maria secure Thunder in the horse trailer, chattering excitedly about the adventures that awaited them at Haven Ranch, Jake realized that every challenge they had faced had made them stronger as a family. Whatever lay ahead in Montana, they would face it together. The first snowfall at Haven Ranch came in early December, 3 weeks after Jake, Sophia, Isabella, and Maria had arrived at the remote Montana sanctuary. Sophia pressed her nose against the frosted window of their cabin, watching fat flakes drift down like pieces of torn paper against the dark pine forest. She had never seen snow before, and the wonder in her dark eyes reminded Jake that not everything in their chaotic journey had been marked by loss and fear. "Can we go outside and touch it?" Sophia asked, her English now flowing more naturally after months of immersion in American life. "After breakfast," Jake promised, pulling on his heavy coat to check on Thunder in the ranch's heated barn. The Montana winter was brutal compared to the Nevada desert where their story had begun. But there was something cleansing about the clean, cold air and endless white landscape that seemed to wash away the shadows of the past. Haven Ranch was unlike anywhere Jake had ever imagined seeking refuge. Nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped mountains, the facility consisted of 12 rustic cabins arranged around a central lodge that housed the dining hall, library, and administrative offices. The ranch was home to 43 people. At any given time, families fleeing domestic violence, witnesses in federal protection programs, and children who had escaped human trafficking situations. Everyone here understood the weight of secrets and the necessity of starting over. Dr. Sarah Winters, the ranch's director and a former FBI psychologist, had explained their philosophy during the orientation meeting 3 weeks earlier. Healing happens when people feel safe enough to remember who they were before trauma tried to redefine them, she had said, her grey eyes kind but penetrating. Our job isn't to make you forget what happened. It's to help you remember that those events don't determine your worth or your future. For Jake, the ranch represented more than just a safe harbor from cartel threats. It was the first place since Rebecca's death where he had felt genuinely useful beyond his role as Sophia and Isabella's guardian. The ranch needed someone with his construction and maintenance skills to help winterize the facilities, and Jake threw himself into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself. "You're different here," Maria observed one evening as they sat in the lodge's common room, watching Sophia and Isabella play board games with other children who spoke a mixture of languages and carried their own invisible wounds. "More like the person I imagine you were before everything fell apart." Jake considered her words while watching Isabella patiently teach a younger boy from El Salvador how to play checkers. The 6-year-old had appointed herself as a translator and cultural bridge for newly arrived children, using her experience with displacement to help others navigate their first days at the ranch. "I think I'm remembering how to be part of something larger than my own problems," Jake admitted. "These kids here, they've all been through hell, but they're not letting it destroy them. It makes my grief seem less consuming, I guess." The Jim Ranch's therapeutic program was unlike anything Jake had experienced during his brief attempts at counseling after Rebecca's death. Instead of sitting in sterile offices talking about feelings, the children and adults at Haven Ranch worked through their trauma by caring for animals, learning practical skills, and building relationships with people who understood their experiences without requiring detailed explanations. Sophia had gravitated immediately toward the ranch's therapy horses, gentle giants who seemed to sense her need for non-verbal connection. Under the guidance of Emma Rodriguez, an equine therapist who had fled domestic violence with her own 2 children, Sophia was learning to brush, feed, and eventually ride a calm mare named Moonbeam. The transformation in the little girl was remarkable. And to witness, horses don't lie, Emma explained to Jake as they watched Sophia confidently lead Moonbeam around the training corral. They respond to authentic emotion, not to the masks we wear to protect ourselves. Sophia is learning that she can be vulnerable without being in danger. Isabella, meanwhile, had discovered a passion for cooking in the lodge's industrial kitchen. Chef Roberto Mendez, a former gang member who had found redemption through culinary arts, taught her how to prepare traditional dishes from various Latin American countries. The kitchen became Isabella's laboratory for exploring her cultural identity while developing skills that made her feel useful and accomplished. Food is medicine, Chef Roberto told Jake during one of Isabella's cooking lessons. When we feed people, we're telling them they matter, they belong, they deserve nourishment. For children who have been told they're worthless, learning to nourish others is revolutionary. The ranch's educational program was equally innovative. Instead of traditional classrooms, children learned through project-based activities that combined academic subjects with practical applications. Sophia and Isabella were part of a group that was designing and building birdhouses for local wildlife, a project that required them to use math, science, reading, and problem-solving skills while creating something beautiful and functional. Ms. Jennifer Park, their teacher, was a former corporate lawyer who had survived human trafficking as a teenager and devoted her life to education as a form of liberation. She understood that children who had experienced disruption and trauma needed learning environments that felt safe and relevant to their lived experiences. Traditional education often assumes that children come from stable backgrounds with consistent support systems, Ms. Park explained during a parent conference with Jake and Maria. Our kids need to see immediate connections between what they're learning and how it can help them build better lives. Abstract concepts come later, after they've rebuilt their confidence in their own abilities. The winter months at Haven Ranch passed with a rhythm that felt almost normal. Jake worked on construction projects during the day, helped with homework in the evenings, and participated in family therapy sessions twice a week with Dr. Elizabeth. Chen, a specialist in childhood trauma who helped them process their experiences as a unit rather than as individuals carrying separate burdens. You've become a family in the truest sense, Dr. Chen observed during one of their sessions. Not because you share blood, but because you've chosen to commit to each other's well-being despite the challenges that commitment brings. The observation felt accurate to Jake. Somewhere between the desert rescue and the Montana snow, he had stopped thinking of Sophia and Isabella as his brother's children that he was temporarily caring for. They had become his daughters in every way that mattered, and he had become their father not just legally, but emotionally. Maria, too, had found her place in their unconventional family structure. Her nursing skills made her invaluable to the ranch's medical staff, and she had assumed a grandmother-like role with many of the children beyond Sophia and Isabella. The woman, who had been living alone in an empty house in Las Vegas, was now surrounded by people who needed her expertise and appreciated her nurturing presence. The turning point came in February, during a particularly brutal blizzard that trapped everyone at the ranch for 5 days. With no outside contact and limited activities, the community was forced to rely entirely on each other for entertainment and emotional support. What could have been a claustrophobic experience instead became a celebration of resilience and creativity. Sophia organized art classes for the younger children, teaching them to create colorful paintings that brightened the lodge's walls. Isabella worked with Chef Roberto to prepare elaborate meals, using only the ingredients available in the ranch's storage facilities. Jake led a group of adults and teenagers in building an indoor obstacle course that kept everyone physically active, despite being trapped inside. On the third night of the blizzard, the entire community gathered in the lodge for what became an Impromptu talent show. Children who had arrived at the ranch silent and withdrawn sang songs in their native languages, performed traditional dances, and shared stories about their home countries. Adults who had been focused solely on survival and safety rediscovered parts of themselves they thought had been lost forever. Isabella surprised everyone, including Jake, by standing up during the talent show and speaking to the entire community in both Spanish and English. "My sister and I lost our mama and papa," she said, her young voice carrying across the silent room. "We thought we would never have a family again, but families aren't just the people you're born with. Families are the people who choose to love you even when you're scared and broken and don't know how to love them back." She paused, looking directly at Jake, with an expression of gratitude and affection that made his throat tighten with emotion. "Tio Papa found us in the desert when we were dying. Tia Maria gave us a home when we had nowhere to go. And everyone here has shown us that being different doesn't mean being alone." The applause that followed Isabella's impromptu speech was thunderous. But what moved Jake most was seeing Sophia stand up and hug her sister with fierce pride. These children who had been through unimaginable trauma were not just surviving. They were thriving, growing, becoming leaders and healers in their own right. Dr. Winters approached Jake later that evening as he was tucking the girls into their bunk beds. "I've been working in family services for 15 years, she said quietly, "and I've rarely seen children recover from severe trauma as completely as Sophia and Isabella have. Whatever you're doing, it's working." Jake shook his head. "I'm not doing anything special. I'm just trying to keep the promise I made to their mother." "You're doing more than that," Dr. Winters insisted. "You're showing them that love doesn't have to be earned or deserved. You're teaching them that family is something you build, not something that happens to you. That's not a small gift." The news from Detective Herrera came in March, delivered via a secure phone call that interrupted the ranch's peaceful morning routine. The cartel investigation had resulted in multiple arrests, including Miguel Santos, the leader who had been hunting for Sophia and Isabella. More importantly, the network that had been searching for the girls had been dismantled, with key members either in custody or fleeing to avoid prosecution. "It's over," Herrera said, his voice carrying relief that Jake could feel even through the static of the satellite connection. "The threat to your family has been neutralized. You're free to return to your lives whenever you're ready." Jake hung up the phone and walked outside into the crisp mountain air, processing the magnitude of what he had just learned. For months, their lives had been shaped by the need to hide, to stay vigilant, to prepare for threats that might materialize at any moment. Now, suddenly, they were free to make choices based on what they wanted, rather than what they feared. When he shared the news with Sophia, Isabella, and Maria, their reaction surprised him. Instead of excitement about returning to Las Vegas, both girls expressed reluctance to leave Haven Ranch. "Can we stay until summer?" Isabella asked. "I want to see what the mountains look like when all the snow melts." Sophia, who had been grooming Moonbeam when Jake told them the news, looked up with questioning eyes. "Do we have to leave if we don't want to?" Jake realized that somewhere during their months at the ranch, home had stopped being a place they had fled from and become a place they had chosen to build together. The question wasn't whether they were safe to return to their old life, but whether they wanted to create an entirely new one. "We can stay as long as we want," Jake said, kneeling down to be at eye level with both girls. "This is our family and we get to decide together where our family lives." Maria, who had been listening to this conversation with a thoughtful expression, made a suggestion that surprised everyone. What if we didn't have to choose? What if we could have roots in both places? The idea that emerged from that conversation was both practical and revolutionary. Jake could work construction contracts that took him across the western states, with Haven Ranch serving as their home base during the winter months and Las Vegas as their residence during the school year. Sophia and Isabella could maintain their friendships and educational progress in both communities, while Jake and Maria could contribute their skills to the ranch's ongoing mission of helping families in transition. "It's unconventional," Dr. Winters admitted when they presented the proposal to her. "But then again, your entire family story has been unconventional. If it works for you and serves the needs of the community, I can't think of any reason why it wouldn't be possible." As spring arrived at Haven Ranch and the snow began to melt from the mountain peaks, Jake found himself standing in the same spot where he had received Detective Herrera's call. But instead of processing the end of their time in hiding, he was planning the beginning of their time choosing how to live. Sophia and Isabella were in the corral with Emma, learning advanced riding techniques that would serve them well during summer trail rides through the Montana wilderness. Maria was in the lodge, working with new families who had arrived seeking the same sanctuary and healing that had transformed their own lives. Jake pulled Carmen's letter from his wallet, the paper now worn soft from months of handling. He read her words again, about families and second chances and the belief that good people would appear when her daughters needed them most. Carmen had been right about many things, but she couldn't have imagined that the stranger who found her children in the desert would not just save them, but be saved by them in return. The future stretched ahead of them, no longer marked by fear or uncertainty, but by possibility and choice. They were no longer refugees from their past, but architects of their future, building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy and the foundation of love. 2 years later, Jake Morrison stood at the edge of Highway 93 in Nevada, exactly where he had first encountered the white pickup truck that changed everything. The desert stretched endlessly in both directions, shimmering with heat waves under the August sun. But this time he wasn't alone. Sophia and Isabella flanked him on either side, now 8 years old and transformed beyond recognition from the dying children he had found under a Joshua tree. "This is where Mama died?" Sophia asked, her voice steady but thoughtful, as she studied the landscape with the analytical eye of an artist. She carried a small canvas and watercolors in her backpack, planning to create a painting that would honor her mother's memory in a way that celebrated rather than mourned. "Not far from here," Jake confirmed, pointing toward the ridge where he had first spotted the circling buzzards. "She made it farther than anyone thought possible, bringing you girls to safety." Isabella, who had grown into a confident and articulate 9-year-old, placed a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked at Haven Ranch on the ground beside the highway marker. "She would be proud of who we became," she said, with the wisdom of a child who had learned to transform pain into purpose. The memorial service had been Isabella's idea, suggested during one of their family therapy sessions with Dr. Chen the previous month. "I want to go back to where our story began," she had said. "Not because I'm sad, but because I want to thank Mama for bringing us to Tio Papa." Jake had been reluctant at first, worried that returning to the site of Carmen's death might trigger renewed trauma for the girls. But Dr. Chen had encouraged the visit as a healthy way to process their history and recognize how far they had traveled, both literally and emotionally, since that terrible day in the desert. The journey back to Nevada had become a celebration of their unconventional family's success. They had driven down from Haven Ranch in a new truck, with Thunder following in a proper horse trailer rather than the makeshift travois that had carried them to safety years earlier. Maria rode in the passenger seat, planning to return to Las Vegas for a week to check on her house and visit old friends from the hospital. The past 2 years had exceeded everyone's expectations for healing and growth. Sophia had not only overcome her early trauma, but had emerged as a gifted artist whose paintings were displayed throughout Haven Ranch's main lodge. Her therapists marveled at her ability to transform difficult emotions into beautiful visual expressions, and several galleries in Montana had expressed interest in showcasing her work when she was older. Isabella had become a bridge builder in every environment she entered. At Haven Ranch, she translated for newly arrived families and helped organize cultural celebrations that honored the diverse backgrounds of the community members. During their months in Las Vegas, she had excelled academically while also volunteering. At Maria's hospital, reading to pediatric patients in both English and Spanish, Jake's own transformation had been equally dramatic. The man who had spent 3 years drifting aimlessly after his wife's death had discovered a calling he never knew existed. Working with families at Haven Ranch had shown him that his experiences with loss and recovery could help others navigate their own journeys toward healing. He had completed certification as a trauma counselor and was planning to establish a permanent therapeutic program that would serve families throughout the Mountain West. "Look," Sophia said suddenly, pointing toward a dust cloud approaching from the south. "Someone's coming." A Nevada Highway Patrol vehicle pulled up behind their truck, and Officer Patricia Williams stepped out into the desert heat. She was a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that immediately put the girls at ease. "Are you folks having car trouble?" she asked, then paused as recognition dawned on her face. "Wait, you're Jake Morrison, aren't you? The man who rescued those little girls a couple years back?" Jake nodded, surprised to be recognized. "You know about our story?" Officer Williams smiled warmly. "Every officer in the state knows about your story. We use it in training now as an example of civilian heroism and the importance of never giving up on missing persons cases." She knelt down to Isabella and Sophia's level. "And you two must be the famous Morrison sisters. I've heard you're both doing amazingly well." "We came to say goodbye to our mama," Isabella explained with the matter-of-fact directness that characterized her communication style. "She died here, but she saved us first." Officer Williams's expression grew more thoughtful. "Would you like me to show you something special? There's a memorial marker about a mile from here that you might find meaningful." Jake looked puzzled. "A memorial marker?" "Follow me," Officer Williams said, climbing back into her patrol car. "It's something the community did after your story made the news." They drove slowly along a dirt road that Jake didn't remember from his desperate journey years earlier. After about 10 minutes, Officer Williams stopped beside a small metal sign planted in a grove of Joshua trees. The sign read, "Carmen Vasquez Memorial Rest Area, in honor of a mother's love and sacrifice." Below the main inscription, someone had added a smaller plaque. "She carried hope across the desert so her daughters could find their future." Jake felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He had never imagined that Carmen's story would resonate beyond their small family, but apparently her courage had touched people throughout Nevada and beyond. "Local churches raised money for the memorial," Officer Williams explained, "but it was actually suggested by other immigrant families who said Carmen's sacrifice gave them hope during their own difficult journeys." Sophia immediately began setting up her easel, determined to capture the memorial site in watercolors. Isabella walked among the Joshua trees, touching their twisted branches and whispering something in Spanish that Jake couldn't hear but understood was a private conversation with her mother's memory. As the girls explored the memorial area, Jake found himself reflecting on the incredible chain of events that had brought them to this moment. If his truck hadn't broken down that day, if he hadn't spotted the buzzards, if Carmen hadn't survived long enough to give him the letter that revealed their family connection, any one of those variables changing could have resulted in a completely different outcome. "She knew," Isabella said suddenly, appearing beside Jake with the insight that had become her trademark. "Mama knew you were family before you did. That's why she wasn't afraid to trust you." Jake looked down at this remarkable child who had survived civil war, desert crossing, orphanhood, cartel threats, and cultural displacement, only to emerge as a leader and healer in her own right. How could she have known that? Because love recognizes love, Isabella replied, with the simple wisdom of someone who had learned that families could be born in moments of crisis as easily as in years of planning. Mama loved us enough to bring us to you, and you loved us enough to become our papa. Sophia finished her painting as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The watercolor depicted the memorial site with vibrant blues and purples that transformed the harsh landscape into something beautiful and hopeful. At the center of the composition, she had painted a figure of a woman with outstretched arms, as if blessing everything around her. "It's perfect," Maria said, studying Sophia's artwork with the appreciation of someone who had watched the artist grow from a traumatized child into a confident young creator. "Your mama would love it." As they prepared to leave the memorial site, Jake realized that this visit had marked the completion of a circle that began with desperate rescue and evolved into intentional family building. They were no longer defined by the tragedy that brought them together, but by the love they had chosen to cultivate in its aftermath. The drive back to Las Vegas was filled with comfortable conversation and shared memories, the girls chattering about their plans for the upcoming school year and their excitement about returning to Haven Ranch for the winter months. Their bi-state lifestyle had become a source of richness rather than instability, allowing them to maintain connections in both communities while serving as ambassadors between very different worlds. That evening, as they settled into Maria's house for their week-long visit, Jake received a phone call that brought their story full circle in an unexpected way. Detective Herrera was calling with news about Miguel Santos, the cartel leader whose pursuit had forced them to flee to Montana. "Santos died in federal prison last month," Herrera reported. "Natural causes, but it means the last person who might have posed a threat to your family is gone. I wanted you to know that chapter of your story is permanently closed." Jake thanked the detective and hung up the phone, then walked outside to where Sophia and Isabella were playing with Maria's cats in the backyard. The threat that had once seemed so overwhelming now felt like ancient history, a shadow that had passed without leaving permanent damage. "Tio Papa," Sophia called out. "Will you tell us the story again? About the day you found us?" It had become a bedtime ritual during their visits to Las Vegas, this retelling of their origin story. But Jake noticed that the details the girls requested had evolved over time. In the beginning, they had wanted to hear about their mother's bravery and sacrifice. Later, they had focused on the rescue itself and Jake's determination to save them. Now their questions centered on the love that had grown between them and the family they had built together. "Once upon a time," Jake began, settling into the porch swing with both girls curled against his sides, "there was a man who thought he had lost everything important in his life. But he was wrong," Isabella interrupted with a grin, "because he hadn't found us yet." "That's right," Jake continued, "and there was a brave mama who carried her daughters across a dangerous desert because she believed that love would find them when they needed it most. And it did," Sophia added softly. "Love found us in the desert, and it brought us home." As the stars emerged over Las Vegas and the girls' breathing deepened into sleep, Jake found himself thinking about Carmen's letter, still carefully preserved in his wallet after all these years. She had written about hope and second chances, about families formed by choice rather than blood, about the possibility that strangers could become salvation. Carmen Vasquez had died, believing that good people would appear to care for her daughters. But she couldn't have imagined that those daughters would appear to care for a broken man who had forgotten how to hope. In saving Sophia and Isabella, Jake had discovered that sometimes the people we rescue end up rescuing us in return. The desert had taken Carmen's life, but it had also given birth to something beautiful and unexpected. A family bound not by genetics, or geography, but by the choice to love each other through every challenge and change that life could bring. Their story had begun with death and desperation, but it had evolved into something that proved the miraculous power of human connection to transform tragedy into triumph. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey, returning to Haven Ranch, where other families were beginning their own stories of survival and recovery. But tonight, Jake Morrison sat on a porch in Las Vegas, holding his daughters close and marveling at the way love could appear in the most unlikely places, carried by the most unlikely people, and create miracles that lasted a lifetime. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.